You should start looking for somewhere else to live, Margaret. We need our space now. The words came from Ashley Collins in a calm, almost casual voice, the kind someone might use when discussing where to put a new couch or what color to paint the kitchen walls. Margaret Collins didn't answer right away. She stood by the stove in the quiet suburban kitchen in Cedar Ridge, Ohio, one hand resting on the wooden counter she had wiped clean thousands of times over the last 7 years. Outside the window, the early evening sun stretched across the backyard where a small plastic basketball hoop leaned beside the fence, a toy she had assembled with her grandson Ethan on a warm Saturday morning years ago. Margaret was 72 years old, but she still moved carefully and deliberately, the way people do when they've spent a lifetime learning patience. She turned off the burner beneath the pot of tomato soup she had been stirring and placed the spoon gently on a folded kitchen towel. Daniel, her son, sat at the table with his eyes fixed on his phone as if the small glowing screen could shield him from the moment unfolding in front of him. Margaret noticed the silence more than the words. Silence had always been the first sign that something in a family was breaking. 7 years earlier, when Ethan was born, the house had sounded very different. There had been late-night crying, hurried footsteps down the hallway, the creak of rocking chairs, and the soft humming Margaret used whenever she held the baby close to her chest. Daniel and Ashley had both been working long hours back then. Ashley was building her marketing career in downtown Cleveland, commuting nearly 40 miles every morning, while Daniel was trying to stabilize his small construction company after a difficult recession. They had asked Margaret to stay just for a little while after Ethan's birth. That was how it started. Margaret sold the small 2-bedroom ranch house she had shared with her late husband for 35 years and moved into the spare bedroom at the end of the hallway. She told everyone it made sense. After all, family helped family. And for years, she did exactly that. She woke up before sunrise to pack Ethan's lunches, drove him 3 miles to preschool every morning, and spent countless afternoons sitting on wooden benches at the local playground while he learned to climb ladders and chase soccer balls across the grass. She remembered the smell of sunscreen, the sound of children laughing, and Ethan's tiny hand gripping her fingers as they crossed the street near Maple Avenue Elementary. The house had once felt like it belonged to all of them. But lately, Margaret had begun to notice small changes. Conversations would stop when she entered a room. Plans were made without asking if she would be home for dinner. Her favorite chair in the living room slowly became the place where folded laundry sat instead of where she read her evening books. And now, standing in that same kitchen she had cleaned every night for years, she finally understood what those small changes meant. Ashley crossed her arms and leaned against the refrigerator with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. Daniel still said nothing. Margaret looked toward the hallway where Ethan's bedroom door was slightly open, a sliver of warm yellow light glowing onto the carpet. For a long moment, she simply breathed in the quiet of the house she had helped hold together, realizing that sometimes the deepest betrayals didn't arrive with shouting or anger. Sometimes they arrived gently, spoken in calm voices across the kitchen table, as if they had been inevitable all along. Margaret did not argue that night. She placed the lid over the pot of soup, wiped the counter one more time, and quietly carried 3 bowls to the table the way she had done thousands of evenings before. Daniel finally set his phone down and cleared his throat, but the words he seemed ready to say never arrived. Ashley simply thanked Margaret for dinner in the same polite tone she used when speaking to a neighbor or a cashier at the grocery store. The conversation shifted to ordinary things, the kind of small talk people use when they want to pretend nothing uncomfortable has happened. Ethan talked about a science project at school. Daniel mentioned a new roofing contract his company had just secured on the north side of town. Ashley described a meeting with a client who wanted to rebrand a chain of coffee shops. Margaret listened carefully, nodding when it seemed appropriate, but her thoughts drifted back through the years that had quietly led to this moment. When Ethan was born, the house had felt almost chaotic with exhaustion and excitement. Margaret still remembered the first night she arrived with 2 suitcases and a box of old photo albums. Ethan was only 5 days old then, a tiny bundle wrapped in a blue hospital blanket, while Daniel paced nervously through the living room, holding a bottle warmer he had no idea how to use. Ashley had been recovering from a difficult delivery and could barely sleep more than an hour at a time. Margaret had stepped into the rhythm of the household without needing instructions. She woke before dawn to prepare oatmeal and coffee. She learned exactly how Ethan liked to be held when he cried in the middle of the night. She folded tiny shirts and washed endless loads of laundry while Daniel rushed to job sites and Ashley hurried to early meetings downtown. At first, everyone seemed grateful. Ashley would sometimes squeeze Margaret's shoulder and say she did not know how they would manage without her. Daniel told his friends that his mother was the reason their family was holding together during those exhausting first months. Over time, those words faded into the background of daily life, replaced by routine and expectation. Margaret became the person who knew where every missing sock was, the person who remembered dentist appointments and school picture days. She drove Ethan 3 miles to Maple Avenue Elementary every morning in the old silver sedan she had kept after selling her house. The drive took only 7 minutes, but Ethan always filled it with stories about spelling tests, playground games, and the dream he had the night before. Margaret listened to every word as if it mattered more than anything else in the world. For years that routine defined her days. School drop-offs, grocery trips that stretched down 3 long aisles, afternoons waiting in the carpool lane with the radio quietly playing country music, evenings cooking meals while the smell of garlic and onions filled the kitchen. It had never felt like a sacrifice to her. It had felt like belonging. And yet somewhere along the way the tone of the house began to change in small ways that were easy to ignore at first. Ashley stopped asking Margaret to sit with them after dinner. Daniel started talking about future plans for the house that never included her name. The spare bedroom at the end of the hallway slowly turned from Margaret's room into something that felt more like temporary space. Now, sitting at the dinner table that night, Margaret realized that the quiet shift had been happening for a long time. The words Ashley spoke earlier had simply made it impossible to pretend otherwise. The next morning Margaret woke before the sun, the same way she had for most of the last 7 years. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a garbage truck somewhere down the street. She moved slowly through the kitchen, turning on the small light above the sink and filling the kettle with water. Outside, the sky over Cedar Ridge was still gray, and the backyard grass carried a thin layer of dew that shimmered faintly in the porch light. Margaret measured coffee grounds into the machine with steady hands. It was a routine she could perform without thinking, yet that morning every movement felt strangely deliberate, as if she were noticing the details of the kitchen for the first time. The small crack in the tile near the refrigerator, the faded magnet from a family vacation to Lake Erie, the calendar on the wall still showing the previous month because no one had remembered to turn the page. For years Margaret had been the one who kept these small things in order. She poured a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Daniel usually checked his phone before leaving for work. The chair creaked slightly beneath her weight. From the hallway, she heard soft footsteps followed by the gentle thud of a bedroom door opening. Ethan appeared a moment later, his hair still messy from sleep and a blanket wrapped loosely around his shoulders. He was 9 years old now, tall for his age, with the same thoughtful eyes Daniel had when he was a child. He walked straight to Margaret without hesitation and leaned against her arm the way he had done since he first learned how to walk. Margaret felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest as she placed her hand on his shoulder. Ethan asked if she was driving him to school that morning. His voice carried the simple certainty that she always would. Margaret smiled softly and told him yes. She helped him pour cereal into a bowl and added slices of banana, the way he liked. The kitchen slowly filled with the familiar sounds of morning life. A spoon against ceramic, the refrigerator opening and closing, the faint ticking of the wall clock above the pantry door. Yet beneath those ordinary sounds something else lingered, something unspoken that had settled into the house during the night. Margaret noticed that Ashley had left early for work without saying goodbye. Daniel walked through the kitchen 10 minutes later already dressed for a job site, his boots leaving faint marks of dried dirt on the floor Margaret had cleaned the evening before. He greeted Ethan, grabbed a travel mug of coffee, and gave Margaret a quick nod that felt more like obligation than affection. No one mentioned the conversation from the night before. It floated silently between them like a cloud no one wanted to look at directly. After breakfast, Margaret helped Ethan pack his backpack with math worksheets, a blue lunchbox, and the science project he had spent 3 evenings building at the dining table with her help. They stepped outside into the cool Ohio morning and walked to the driveway where Margaret's silver sedan waited. The drive to Maple Avenue Elementary took exactly 7 minutes if the traffic light on Cedar Street stayed green. Ethan talked the entire way about a reading assignment and the possibility of joining the school soccer team in the fall. Margaret listened carefully, nodding and asking gentle questions, storing each small detail the way she always had. When the car pulled into the school drop-off lane, Ethan turned toward her with a wide smile and said he would see her after school. Margaret watched him run toward the front doors with his backpack bouncing lightly against his shoulders. For a moment she sat in the car without starting the engine, realizing that routines can feel permanent right up until the moment someone decides they are not needed anymore. Margaret drove home slowly after leaving the school parking lot, keeping both hands on the steering wheel as the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge passed by outside the window. The same houses stood in neat rows along Maple Avenue, each with trimmed lawns, mailboxes at the curb, and front porches where neighbors sometimes waved during summer evenings. She had driven this exact route hundreds of times over the years, yet that morning every familiar landmark seemed to carry a memory. The small park on the corner where Ethan had learned how to ride a bicycle with training wheels. The bakery beside the gas station where Margaret sometimes bought cinnamon rolls on Friday mornings as a surprise. The hardware store where Daniel once spent half an afternoon choosing paint for the living room, while Margaret entertained a restless toddler by letting him hold the color samples. When she pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had, a 2-story brick home with white shutters and a maple tree growing near the front walkway. Margaret sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, noticing how quiet the property felt without Ethan's laughter drifting through the yard. Inside, the air carried the faint smell of the coffee she had brewed earlier. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall. Margaret placed her purse on the counter and walked slowly down the hallway toward the spare bedroom where she had lived since the day she moved in. The room was modest, with a single bed, a wooden dresser, and a small bookshelf filled with paperbacks she read during quiet evenings. On the dresser stood a framed photograph of Daniel as a young boy standing beside his father at a fishing dock along Lake Erie. Margaret picked up the frame and studied the picture for a long moment. Daniel had been 8 years old in that photo, wearing a red baseball cap that looked too large for his head. His father had been smiling proudly with one arm resting on the railing of the dock, the afternoon sun reflecting off the water behind them. Margaret remembered that day clearly. The wind had been strong, and Daniel had insisted on casting the fishing line again and again, even though he never caught anything. His father had laughed and told him patience was the most important skill a person could learn. Margaret placed the photograph back on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed. For years, she had believed that patience would hold families together the same way it had helped raise a child. She had believed that if she continued showing kindness, if she continued helping without complaint, the love inside the house would remain steady. Yet now the quiet room felt different, as if the meaning of her presence had changed without anyone explaining when or why. Her eyes moved slowly around the space. 2 suitcases rested at the bottom of the closet. A folded quilt lay across the foot of the bed. On the bookshelf, a small ceramic mug held pencils Ethan used whenever he came in to draw pictures while she read in the evenings. Margaret realized that nearly everything she owned could fit inside those 2 suitcases if necessary. The thought did not frighten her as much as she expected. Instead, it brought a strange sense of clarity. She stood up and opened the closet door, looking carefully at the rows of clothes hanging neatly on the rack. For the first time since Ashley's words the night before, Margaret began to understand that leaving might not simply be an ending. Sometimes the quiet moments after a painful conversation are when a person begins to see the truth of their place in a family, and sometimes that truth changes everything. Margaret spent the rest of that morning moving quietly through the house, not rushing, not hesitating, simply observing the place the way someone does when they begin to understand that their time there may be ending. Sunlight slowly filled the living room through the tall front windows, stretching across the hardwood floor Daniel had installed himself nearly 6 years earlier. She remembered the weekend he worked on that floor, kneeling for hours with measuring tape and wood glue while Ethan crawled across unfinished boards laughing at the echo his tiny footsteps made. Margaret had brought lemonade outside every hour because the July heat had been nearly 90 degrees that afternoon. Daniel had thanked her then, wiping sweat from his forehead with a worn cloth, telling her he could never have managed everything without her help. The memory returned now with surprising clarity. Margaret walked into the living room and straightened a stack of magazines on the coffee table before sitting down in the same chair where she usually read during quiet afternoons. The house felt larger than usual without Ethan's voice drifting through the hallway. For several minutes, she simply listened to the stillness, the low ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of a lawn mower somewhere across the street. Eventually, she stood and walked toward the small desk near the staircase where Daniel kept household paperwork. Margaret did not open any drawers or search through documents. Instead, she looked at the framed photograph sitting beside the desk lamp. It showed the three of them standing in front of the house on the day Ethan started kindergarten. Daniel had his arm around Ashley while Ethan stood proudly between them, holding a bright blue backpack. Margaret had been the one taking the photograph that morning. Someone had suggested she step into the frame afterward, but the moment had already passed, and everyone had been in a hurry. Margaret returned to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, then stepped out onto the back porch. The maple tree near the fence moved gently in the breeze, its leaves whispering softly against one another. She remembered planting that tree with Ethan when he was 4 years old. He had insisted on using a small plastic shovel that bent every time he pushed it into the dirt. It had taken nearly 2 hours to dig the hole deep enough for the roots. Margaret smiled faintly at the memory before turning back toward the house. By early afternoon, she drove to Maple Avenue Elementary to pick Ethan up, just as she always did. The carpool lane was crowded with parents and grandparents waiting patiently in a long line of vehicles. When Ethan climbed into the passenger seat, he immediately began talking about a science experiment involving magnets and paper clips. Margaret listened carefully while guiding the sedan back toward Cedar Ridge. They stopped at the grocery store on the way home because Ethan asked if they could buy the chocolate chip cookies he liked after school. Inside the store, Margaret moved slowly through the aisles, placing bread, milk, and a small bag of apples into the cart, while Ethan walked beside her pushing the handle with both hands. Everything about the afternoon followed the same routine it always had. Yet Margaret could feel the quiet weight of Ashley's words lingering in the background of every moment. When they returned home, Ethan ran to the backyard with a soccer ball, while Margaret carried the groceries into the kitchen. She set the apples in a bowl and placed the bread on the counter, pausing for a moment as she looked around the familiar room. For years she had believed this house was a place she would always belong. Now she understood that belonging is not something a person can hold forever if others decide it is no longer convenient. That evening the house slowly filled with the familiar sounds of people returning from their day. Daniel's truck pulled into the driveway a little after 5:30, the engine rumbling briefly before the door slammed shut. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter slicing apples while the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. Through the window, she could see Ethan kicking his soccer ball toward the fence again and again, counting each attempt out loud, as if he were practicing for a game that only existed in his imagination. Daniel walked in a few moments later carrying the tired posture of someone who had spent the day climbing ladders and measuring roofs beneath the Ohio sun. He greeted Ethan through the open back door and washed his hands at the sink without saying much else. Margaret noticed the way he avoided looking directly at her, the way people sometimes do when they know a conversation is waiting but they are not ready to face it. Ashley arrived shortly after 6 o'clock, her car tires crunching softly against the gravel near the garage. She stepped into the kitchen with the quick, confident movement Margaret had seen countless times over the years, placing her handbag on the counter while glancing briefly at the groceries Margaret had purchased earlier that afternoon. She thanked Margaret for picking up milk and bread, her voice polite but distant, as if the favor had been expected rather than appreciated. For a while the evening unfolded in ordinary ways. Margaret prepared dinner while Daniel checked his messages, and Ethan described his day at school in enthusiastic detail. The smell of roasted chicken and herbs slowly filled the kitchen. Plates were placed on the table. Chairs moved quietly across the floor. Anyone passing by the house might have believed it was simply another peaceful family evening. Yet beneath the calm routine, Margaret sensed the quiet tension that had settled over the household since the night before. Daniel spoke carefully, choosing his words as if he were stepping around something fragile. Ashley kept glancing at the clock above the stove. Ethan remained unaware of the shift in atmosphere, happily explaining how his teacher had demonstrated a magnet experiment that made metal paper clips jump across a desk. Margaret listened with gentle attention, smiling when he asked if magnets could work underwater. She told him they probably could and promised they might try an experiment together during the weekend. The moment lingered in the air after she said it, because Margaret suddenly realized she did not know whether she would still be there that weekend. When dinner ended, she cleared the dishes and rinsed them slowly beneath warm water while the others moved into the living room. Through the doorway, she could hear the television playing quietly and Ethan laughing at something on the screen. The sound felt comforting and distant at the same time. Margaret dried the final plate with a towel and placed it carefully into the cabinet. Then she turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dim glow from the hallway, understanding that the life she had built inside this house had been made from years of small, ordinary actions that no one had ever needed to question until now. And sometimes when a family decides those quiet actions are no longer necessary, the person who performed them must decide what their own next step will be. Later that night, the house grew quiet much earlier than usual. Ethan went to bed after Margaret helped him finish his reading assignment and reminded him to place his science notebook back inside his backpack. He hugged her quickly before walking down the hallway, his small footsteps fading as his bedroom door closed softly behind him. Margaret remained standing in the hallway for a moment, listening to the familiar rhythm of the house settling into nighttime silence. The air conditioner hummed gently through the vents, and the refrigerator clicked on in the kitchen. Daniel and Ashley were in the living room speaking in low voices. Margaret could not hear every word, but she recognized the careful tone people use when discussing decisions that affect someone else. She did not move closer to listen. Instead, she turned and walked back to the spare bedroom at the end of the hallway. The room felt calm and still, illuminated by the warm glow of a small bedside lamp. Margaret sat down at the wooden desk near the window and opened the drawer where she kept a few personal papers. Inside were several envelopes, a worn address book, and a small stack of documents she had not looked at in quite some time. She pulled out one of the envelopes and studied the return. Address printed neatly in the corner. It belonged to Howard Bennett, the attorney who had helped her organize financial matters after her husband passed away nearly a decade earlier. Margaret remembered sitting across from him in a quiet office downtown while he explained every document slowly and clearly, making sure she understood each decision before signing anything. At the time, she had been grateful for his patience, though she had hoped she would never need to revisit those papers again. Margaret placed the envelope on the desk and opened her address book, flipping through several pages until she found the number written carefully in blue ink. She did not dial it yet. Instead, she leaned back in the chair and looked around the room once more. The suitcases at the bottom of the closet remained exactly where they had been that morning. The folded quilt rested neatly across the bed. On the bookshelf, the small ceramic mug still held Ethan's pencils, their tips sharpened from the drawings he made whenever he sat beside her in the evenings. Margaret realized that nothing in the room had changed since Ashley's quiet announcement the night before. The furniture had not moved. The walls had not shifted. Yet something important had become clear to her during the long, quiet hours of the day. For years, she had believed her role inside this house was permanent simply because she had always been there when the family needed help. But now she understood that permanence inside a home depends on more than habit. It depends on respect. Margaret reached forward and closed the address book gently before standing up from the desk. She walked to the window and looked out toward the backyard where the maple tree swayed softly in the night breeze. The porch light illuminated the grass in a pale circle of yellow. Somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. Margaret folded her arms lightly and stood there for several minutes thinking about the road ahead. When she finally turned away from the window, her expression had changed in a subtle but unmistakable way. The uncertainty that had filled the day was slowly giving way to something steadier. She switched off the bedside lamp and allowed the room to fall into darkness, already aware that the next step in her story would begin with a single quiet phone call. The next morning, Margaret woke before sunrise again, but this time the quiet inside the house felt different. The uncertainty that had followed her through the previous day had settled into something calmer, something more deliberate. She dressed slowly and walked into the kitchen where the faint blue light of early morning filtered through the curtains. The coffee machine hummed as it filled the room with a familiar smell, and Margaret poured herself a cup before sitting at the small table near the window. For several minutes, she simply watched the street outside as the sky shifted from gray to pale orange. A delivery truck rolled past the end of the block, and a neighbor stepped outside to collect a newspaper from the driveway. Ordinary life was beginning another day. Margaret reached into the pocket of her sweater and removed the small slip of paper where she had written the phone number the night before. She looked at it for a moment, then stood and walked to the hallway where the house phone rested on a narrow table beneath a framed landscape photograph. Her hand moved steadily as she dialed the number. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Howard Bennett sounded exactly the same as Margaret remembered, calm and attentive. When she introduced herself, he immediately recognized her name. His tone warmed with genuine surprise as he asked how she had been after all these years. Margaret explained that she hoped to schedule a meeting sometime that week because there were several matters she wanted to review. She did not rush through the conversation or offer long explanations. She simply said that circumstances in her family had changed and she wanted to understand the documents they had organized years earlier. Howard listened carefully and told her his office would be open on Thursday morning. Margaret thanked him and placed the phone back on the table with quiet precision. The entire call had lasted less than 3 minutes. Yet something inside her felt lighter afterward, as if a door had quietly opened somewhere ahead. By the time Daniel came into the kitchen a little after 6, Margaret was already preparing breakfast. He greeted her politely and poured himself coffee, still avoiding direct eye contact. Ashley appeared a few minutes later, scrolling through messages on her phone while asking if Ethan had packed his lunch. The routine of the household continued almost exactly as it had every other morning. Yet Margaret moved through the kitchen with a calm focus that had not been there the day before. When Ethan came running in, still tying the laces of his sneakers, Margaret helped him finish his toast and reminded him to bring his science notebook. The drive to Maple Avenue Elementary felt peaceful as sunlight spilled across the road and the trees lining Cedar Street. Ethan chatted excitedly about an upcoming field trip while Margaret listened with the same patient attention she had always given him. After dropping him off, she did not return home immediately. Instead, she guided the silver sedan toward the center of town, passing the grocery store, the library, and the small brick courthouse that stood near the public square. Howard Bennett's office was located 3 blocks beyond that courthouse in a quiet building with large windows facing the street. Margaret slowed the car as she passed it, noting the brass sign beside the entrance that still displayed his name. She did not stop yet. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday. Today she only wanted to see the place again, to remind herself that the next chapter of her life would not depend on anyone's permission. As she drove back toward Cedar Ridge, Margaret felt the steady rhythm of determination replacing the quiet uncertainty that had filled the previous days. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing with complete clarity. She would leave that house with dignity, and she would not walk away empty-handed. Thursday morning arrived with a calm clarity that Margaret had not felt in many years. The air outside carried the cool freshness of early autumn, and the maple tree in the backyard had begun to show faint hints of red along its leaves. Margaret woke before the rest of the house and prepared coffee the same way she always did, moving quietly through the kitchen while the sky slowly brightened beyond the windows. Nothing in the house looked different from the outside. The dishes were clean. The chairs were neatly pushed beneath the table. The refrigerator door still held the same collection of magnets and school papers Ethan had brought home during the last few months. Yet Margaret knew that this morning marked the beginning of something entirely new. After Ethan left for school and Daniel drove away toward another construction job, Margaret stepped outside and climbed into her silver sedan. The drive into town took 15 minutes, passing the familiar roads she had traveled for years. When she reached the brick building where Howard Bennett kept his office, she parked along the curb and sat for a moment with both hands resting gently on the steering wheel. She was not nervous. Instead, she felt steady, the way people feel when they know they are finally facing something they had avoided for too long. Inside the office, the receptionist greeted her warmly and guided her into a quiet conference room with large windows overlooking the courthouse square. Howard Bennett entered a few minutes later carrying a thin folder. He smiled kindly as they shook hands and asked how life had been treating her. Margaret explained the situation in simple words. She described how she had sold her house years earlier to help Daniel and Ashley purchase the home in Cedar Ridge. She reminded him of the paperwork they had completed together after her husband passed away, including the legal agreement that protected the money she contributed toward the purchase. Howard listened carefully and then opened the folder, sliding several documents across the table. He pointed to a line near the bottom of the page and explained that Margaret still held a legal ownership interest in the property because of that original contribution. The house was not solely Daniel and Ashley's asset. Her name remained tied to the investment that had made the purchase possible. Margaret studied the page quietly while the sunlight shifted across the table. For the first time since Ashley's calm instruction to find somewhere else to live, Margaret understood the full truth of her position. She had never been simply a guest in that house. She had been one of the people who built it. Later that afternoon, Margaret returned to Cedar Ridge with a small envelope resting on the passenger seat beside her. She walked through the front door with the same calm expression she had carried all morning. Daniel and Ashley were in the living room discussing weekend plans when she stepped inside. Margaret placed the envelope on the coffee table without raising her voice or changing her tone. Inside were copies of the documents Howard Bennett had printed for her, along with a short letter explaining that she would be arranging a formal review of the property ownership in the coming weeks. The room fell silent as Daniel slowly opened the envelope and began reading the first page. Margaret did not wait for questions or arguments. She simply turned toward the hallway, her steps quiet but steady, already knowing that the dignity she carried with her would remain long after she walked out of that house.